So we are at the final stages of this conference, and in this panel we are going to speak about the international strategies. William Gois, he is part of the Migrant Forum in Asia. Monami Maulik is a member of the Global Coalition on Migration, and Akhtar is a member of Global Union. They are going to tell us what the strategies, international strategies are towards the Global Compact. I'm going to give the floor without further delay to Pav.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Akhtar from Global Union. Delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having us. I'm just going to start with a couple of reflections on this particular process here at the GFMD, and from a Labour perspective, Labour Union perspectives, some reflections. Then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that are being employed and that will be developed by the trade union movement, the Labour movement, over the next year or two as we go into the Global Compact. The first thing that I wanted to comment upon was a reflection really about having to remind ourselves and others about about dealing with the root causes of migration as much as the consequences, because I think there needs to be greater honesty about an understanding about the demographic, economic and climate change factors and conflict. There also needs to be an honest discussion within the European context about why we need migrant workers for the industrial and economic growth in this continent, as well as really as a consequence of the shortfall in working age populations. There is a massive decline in working age population, and there's a massive increase in older people. There is a simple economic factor also which is driving people to come and move around the world. And that's a critical point, really. I'm a trade unionist. 70% or around 70% of the world's migrant community is on the move in pursuit of decent work. It's a startling number, 70%. And it needs, in my view, a proportionate attention here at the GFMD and also in the Global Compact, with, of course, appropriate leadership of those areas of responsibility by the appropriate UN agency. In this context would be the ILO. I know from my own experience of growing up as a migrant child from Pakistan to the United Kingdom, and now more recently from the UK to Switzerland, that decent work deficits and human rights violations go hand in hand in many cases. And that is as relevant as whether you're an adult or a child, whether you're a man or woman, regardless of your national origin, sexual orientation, or any other social background dimension. Certainly as a trade unionist, and also a civil society advocate and activist within the migrant community, I'm conscious that we are interdependent on one another's, to support and amplify our voices at the international and national levels. And so thinking about that, keeping that in mind, that need to amplify our voices, I reflect specifically about this event, the GFMD. I think the focus that we had in terms of discussions was really helpful. It allowed for a richer debate, I think, and a more focused debate. And yes, we should speak with one voice, but we do need to recognise the different accents of the stakeholders who are involved in the process. Some colleagues this morning talked about colleagues from Africa and the Middle East being underrepresented. I agree. I absolutely agree. And that's a concern that we need to address. But equally, as a trade unionist, I'm concerned about the limited voice and space that's been provided to labour unions and the participation of migrant workers in this process. That, again, is an issue that I think we need a little more attention on. Some of that is, of course, connected to red tape and restrictions. For example, I know of migrant workers who weren't able to participate in this conference because they weren't issued visas by the government. There are very simple factors. Others weren't able to participate because they weren't provided with sponsorship support, etc., etc. And those are factors that I think also need to be addressed, in addition to making sure that we have adequate numbers of workers and unions represented in some of the speaker platforms that we have. And then thinking about the Global Compact and its longer-term approach and its non-binding approach, I am concerned that we can't allow that to be taken as a space for governments in particular to abdicate their responsibility for immediate responses. Prevention and mitigation against precarity is really at the root cause, is really at the core of guaranteeing rights to migrant communities. And the Global Compact, should only really be allowed, in my view, to advance those policies that promote decent work and human rights. We also, in terms of the Global Compact, need to be prepared to make timely interventions to challenge poor language when it develops. I mean, I've noticed already, for example, there's some language coming out about regular, meaning, more temporary visa programs. That isn't acceptable to us. That really isn't acceptable. That isn't what regular was intended to be, in my view, and I don't think we should allow that narrative to gain traction and momentum. We also shouldn't be prepared to accept voluntary consultation or voice as and when it's requested. We must assert our right to be heard as equal partners who actively work on the front line, who are commissioned by states to deliver the services and provide the support for migrants. We can't be reduced to a Cinderella state, a sector in the organisation of the Global Compact. And there are models that we can look to for guidance, for direction, for positive, assertion of our right to have a clear and inclusive voice. And I look at the ILO's unique tripartite normative framework as an example of that. We can use that. And certainly at the recent ILO conference in June, at the beginning of this month. Are we still in June or are we in July now?
July.
I think we're in July now.
July.
It all molds into one, right? But certainly, okay. But I think that there, when the approach of governments, employers, and trade unions and civil society plus partners was to formally adopt the ILO framework, the Global Compact framework, needs to be based on normative and a rights-based approach, and that is really, really positive. It shows that we are clear partners and we can arrive at conclusions, in consultation and in dialogue with the states and with employers too. And the final point I'll make in this section is that we need real and concrete, in terms of follow-up, we need real and concrete funding and resources to be able to ensure that there's full implementation of the Global Compact and existing binding UN and migration conventions. Otherwise, it just becomes another one of those nice policy documents that gets stored away in a file somewhere. And that is a reality, that there are some very good, solid, robust pieces of policy, conventions and other out there, but they simply aren't being enforced. And that is a big risk. And I heard that coming through from a number of colleagues in some of the forums, sessions that we were in, that, is this just going to be another paper policy? And actually what we don't need is paper policy. We need a living, breathing dragon, something that has fire, that can inject the fire. I think the colleague this morning talks about injecting fire where it's appropriate and heat where it's appropriate. And that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we make it real. I'll stop there. Gracias.
Gracias. Les voy a pedir que
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you to speak about the new strategies for 3 minutes. We have to do something in order not to rush up at the end. Monami?
Thank you, Berenice and Pav, and thanks to all of you for sticking around. It's been a very intensive and dynamic few days. I wanted to start us off as thinking about the strategies moving forward, our international organizing around this, just grounding us in the realities that we're going to all go back home to. Some of us are going to go back home to the reinstatement of the Muslim travel ban in the US. Many of us are going to go back to communities that are in migration, dealing with every day the issues of borders and issues of what drives people, what displaces people. And so I wanted to just take, I know we're short of time, but to ground us, take 20 seconds of silence to think about those migrant communities and all of the lives that we are here to fight for that are lost every day. So with that in our minds, I want to move us forward, not from a place of disempowerment, but from a place of action, from a place of responsibility and duty after we leave here, and that we may not see each other again in this space for another year and a half. But in that year and a half, many things will happen in this compact that will affect the lives of millions of people for decades to come. And let's be visionary in what we do moving ahead. And when we are visionary, many of us have said that, as particularly those who've been in this struggle and in the migrant rights movement much longer, I won't call you my elders, but you know who you are, who've really committed to this struggle. Really committed to the struggle. I hear a lot that perhaps 15, 20 years ago, many did not think that this kind of moment would happen, where governments would create a negotiated document, binding or non-binding, on all of the elements and the details we're examining now. So, but it is happening and it is moving forward. And one of the concerns that many of us have raised and many of you have raised coming from different regions is that we have a lot of work to do really quickly to even transfer to the ground what we all discussed here. So many people on the ground level in so many places on the front lines don't know what this compact is, don't understand that it's happening and the urgency. And so we have a lot of work to do when we go back to make sure we transmit this information in ways that are understandable and popular and galvanize a broader movement than we are in this room and those who can be here. And in thinking about being visionary and building movement in our strategy moving forward, one of the things I wanted to ask us to question and think carefully and think creatively about how do we also shift the narrative. A lot of what we're being told is that this is a toxic environment, that we've been waiting for this moment for so long, but it's a toxic environment. And the argument there is that a toxic environment means that we have to lower our expectations of what this compact will entail. And many of us have heard that argument before. I know for myself, as being a grassroots migrant organizer in the US, the struggle for comprehensive immigration reform was around the logic of we must sort of placate the public fears, close our borders first, and then some form of legalization will come. And it didn't happen that way. And so we have to really think long-term in the next 5 to 10 years of what may happen given what this compact may be, what our aspirational goals are, and somewhere along the lines of what the reality is of what states' interests are in negotiating the compact. And how do we exert the best pressure, not just inside within these spaces and in the policy advocacy we do, but in the movement we build on the ground, other forms of organizing and advocacy with media, with other sectors, with other social movements to make this a broader struggle than the many of us who are in these rooms. And so thinking about this difficult conversation about red lines and baselines, it's really, I think, was really important that we were here face to face having some of these conversations today. And I'll go through sort of some of what was discussed in those sessions, although I know there were really good reports on it. But I think one of the key things that many of our voices are sharing and coming to consensus on is that we have to center the human and labor rights of migrants. We have to understand the complexities of drivers, even though there's a lot of pushback in sort of the conflating of migrants and refugees. We also have to really constantly tell the story of the reality of what drivers are in this time. Of course, there's a concern from a lot that the compact will focus on returns, readmission, and reintegration. We have to be honest and strategic with each other about what that means, what we can achieve, what we can fight for, how we can be aspirational, but also how we can deal with the reality that there are already millions of people being returned and in detention and facing this at borders. What do we do to actually impact their lives, and particularly if that increases after this compact is adopted? And to that end, I think one of the things we should think about is that if the logic is that our states close their borders and we regularize and manage most migration, I want to ask us to think 5 years from now after this compact, do we really think that all migration will be regular? Do we think that there will be less irregular migration? Or, as some of us have perhaps seen, do we think this will just fuel greater irregular migration, insecurity, and vulnerability? And if that's the case, what do we actually do to take steps to defend and protect the rights of irregular migrants? And I raise this because it is something that's sort of an elephant in the room in the discussions on the compact. And there's a lot of pushback about even what was in the New York Declaration about protecting rights regardless of status. And it's something we have to really lift up. And just to end, I'll say, I know in the next part we're going to talk about regional organizing that's happening. I want to lift up how key that is. This has been an incredible, diverse space of all the regions represented, of migrant-led organizations and networks, and great work to the team at ICMC and the steering committee for doing this. However, I want to stress that when we go back, what often happens is that the folks who can be in New York and Geneva are in New York and Geneva. And then we often forget the leadership and the voices of our regional partners, especially the Global South and migrant-led organizations. So I want to end with a challenge to our allies and friends in New York and Geneva and the bigger NGOs. After this day, make sure that the partners who are here from the regions and migrant organizations are at your table, are in your conversations as these consultations go on in New York and Geneva and beyond in the process. So I'll end there, but I want to end on a powerful note. So I want you to take a minute and think about one person who's a migrant leader who inspires you, who's been a human rights defender, an organizer, a migrant. Just think of that person's name and move forward with that thought. Thank you.
Gracias, Monami.
Thank you, Monami. William.
Thanks. I think, Liz, over the last 2-3 days, one of the things I'm convinced about is that as civil society, in some ways, we are ahead of the governments. And that is an advantage we have, and how can we build on this advantage? And I'm saying ahead of the governments because over the last 2-3 days, when we've met different governments in the corridors, and even in our own space, we've had people come and tell us, we're not clear about what the compact is, what it's going to be. There's a lot of ambiguity about this. And we've heard this over and over again over the last 2-3 days. But in the last 2-3 days, one of the things that has happened with civil society, and this is, it's not that it just happened here, it's been a build-up that came to this space, was that more and more we are becoming clear that we want to, in this space, in the compact space, talk about some of the hard issues that have at times not been discussed in spaces like this. Talk about return, talk about reintegration, talk about detention, talk about women and migration, children. So there's a lot of issues that we have been able to come together on. And civil society, and I guess the challenge now for us in gaining on our advantage is, how do we take this down nationally? How do we take this down nationally? And this will be important for us to look at. What is our strategy at the national level? How are we going to continue this advantage at the national level? Because when you go to your government, whichever agency is responsible for migration, I'm sure many of them will look at us with blank faces when we ask them, what are you going to do about the compact? What is our government going to say about the compact? And when they look at us with that blank face, that is the time maybe we can put forward our position to them, to say, this is what we think. At the national level, this is our key issue. This is important for us. And I think that is the build-up that we will have to do. Take this at the national level. Because this discourse, if it remains at the international level, and speaking of my own region and a couple of other regions that we relate with, if this remains at the international level, you'll get a domination of this discourse by the current political discourse and largely by Europe and the Western nations. And I think this is something we have to recognize. And I know this for our own region, this would be a challenge. This is a challenge for the African region as well. How do we very simply work with our governments, Very simply, work with our governments so that when the time of the negotiations starts, we can actually count how many times our governments take that mic to speak on particular issues. This is what the strategy will have to be. We can't leave this discussion at the international level. It will become a very lopsided discussion. And that's why taking it to the national level would be so important. I realize some of the things that we have done, which we need to correct. For example, there have been, in this process of the build-up, there have been 3 thematic discussions already. So meaning there were supposed to be 6, there were 3 that were already done. And the 3 that were already done, the focus was largely in the centers in which they were done. And all were done in Geneva, right? Or one in New York, 2 in Geneva. And there was, again, it was a discussion that happened in New York and Geneva. It was not a discussion that was very much influenced by the capitals. And we've got 3 more discussions, thematic discussions to happen. And I think we can test our resolve of our governments in engaging in this discourse by engaging with them to see how they will engage, how the capitals will inform that space in Geneva and in New York where these discussions will happen. This is something I think we have to turn this on its head. There's too much of concentration at this level. There's just too much. And we ourselves, I think, are focusing sometimes on this discourse. But we know that we can actually, when a kite is flying, you control the kite by holding the string in your hand on the ground. And that is what we need to focus. No matter how much this discussion happens at the international level, what work we will do at the national level with our governments will determine the shape this compact will take. And most of us in this room work at the local and national level. Very few of us in this room actually do international kind of work. And that's why it is so important that that work that we do on the ground on a daily basis gets captured in that way. I think what would be important for us, and Monami has reflected on that, there has been some movement over the last 2 days and over the last few months of trying to identify what would be the issues. And I agree that there would have to be, this is the stage of consultation. As long as we are willing to put in the effort in being clear about what we want to say, it doesn't matter if there are 100 issues or 10 issues. But if we can only do the work on 10, let's do the work on 10 issues. Or we can only do the work on 12, let's do the work on 12 issues. But let's focus on what do we want to say. And let's see how far we can push that advocacy. Don't take the foot off the pedal. This is the consultation stage. So let's put this, what civil society wants to see in 20 years from now. In 20 years from now, what we want to see, let's put our foot on the pedal on that. So that once the negotiation starts, that will be the time then we can, see how we want to play with the foot on the pedal kind of thing. But let's be clear on how we want to zero in on some of these issues. And this is a process that is already begun at the international level. In the green room today, in the first day, there has been some throwing around of ideas, and I think this will continue. Organization-wise, at the national level, at the regional level, we have to be able to identify what would be our priority areas, what would be our priority themes, and build actionable commitments around them that governments can actually take on.
Muchas gracias, William.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Monami, and thank you, Paf, for these kind words, for this light in order to know what the next steps should be. I'm going to open the floor with 3 1-minute interventions. If you are not going to speak longer than 1 minute, do not raise your hand because we do not have much time. Then we'll go back to the panel for the closing. Buenas tardes. Vengo de una organización belga. Mi pregunta es para el señor Paf del sindicato Uniglobal. Estamos de acuerdo con muchas de las cosas que ha dicho, la migración circular.
What I was not really agreeing on with you is that labor unions aren't. Okay, I'm gonna not go around because I only have 1 minute. So let's say that it is a tripartite system. This is the ILO. Civil society, the other part of civil society, isn't included in any three-party system. So I really urge unions to play up their role there and maybe create channels and ways where the rest of civil society can have impact on a three or maybe four-party system. And also maybe you can challenge your labor unions, your member unions, to be open for legal pathways of migration, because we see in our context that very often labor unions don't want too much labor migration. So if you could play a role in that, because labor unions listen a lot more to other labor unions than to civil society. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por...
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for sticking to that minute, Jibril.
In the last panel, Rex brought to our attention the risk of safe, orderly, and regular migration being interpreted in a literal, absurd, and restrictive manner. And I think I'm grateful that he did that. And we shouldn't allow anybody to take us to that literal and limited interpretation, because the New York Declaration itself has given a context to show that it should not be interpreted there. Paragraph 22, which is the first one on the commitment to both migrants and refugees, says that it would be people-centered, human rights-based, and dignified. So all of these, safe, regular, and orderly, would be interpreted on that basis. So I'm just making that point so that we don't go back, and anybody who seek absurd interpretation should just be referred to Section 22 and no more said.
Gracias. Acá, por favor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Najafi. I work for Information and Counseling Center for Female Migrants and Refugees in Cologne. I'm working a long time for human rights in Iran, as I come originally, and now 30 years in Germany. I came undocumented to Germany and applied for asylum, and I got asylum. And I'm working now 25 years in my counseling center. We have done learning by doing, as was in refugee, but I have realized and I have learned human rights instruments and conventions, and I'm happy that I have learned them. But they were far from us. They were just in New York or in Geneva, but not in Cologne, in our everyday life. And I'm now, it's my third attendance of GFMD, and last two, that they were a lot theoretically. And this one, it's the first one that I say, oh, I have learned for my work, and I'm happy, and I'm doing a very important job, and when I go back, I'm very inspired and empowered. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Adelante y luego atrás.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis.
Thank you. Espace Africain International in Geneva, member of the Swiss platform, also member of MAID, Migration and Development Network. My question, I address it to William, concerning appropriation of the global compact at a national level. Whilst facing our governments, who is going to trigger the debate of civil society? I'd like to know, I'd like to make a suggestion, because MAID International exists. It's based in Brussels, and MAID International, and you have at a regional level a presence, MAID Africa. Why not invest information-wise, awareness-wise? Why not give the responsibility to these different networks, MAID at a regional level, and whilst facing our governments. So thank you very much.
Gracias. Allá atrás.
Thank you very much.
Allá en la pared, por favor.
Hello, I'm David Mounir-Nabdi again from Lebanon. Not to be sort of repeating in a cycle around innovation and technology, but just to say quickly, I've had several people come up from these conversations the last few days and express their concerns around this discussion of building businesses and enterprises, innovation and technology for the benefit of migrants. And a lot of people have expressed concerns about almost anything dealing with businesses and building businesses that are potentially profitable relating to these issues. Two things on this. One is I think that we frequently have, I've worked in private sector, I've worked in policy and politics, I've worked in academia, and I've worked in international organizations with the UN, FAO in Syria, etc. And I've seen from all of these angles oftentimes a strange sense of sort of negativity and competition with the others rather than a sense of positivity and collaboration. So I'm a firm believer that we should figure ways to work more with business and work through business, look at profit that is positive in a positive light, and I think that there's a huge amount of benefit that we can build on with that. As well, I'm a firm believer in social enterprise, social impact, and that the values that I think many of us share in this room, we can express through positive enterprise to achieve some of these goals that would either never be possible or be much more difficult through a pure sort of nonprofit or NGO approach. So hopefully over the coming weeks or months, we'll be building out more of this stuff around innovation and social entrepreneurship as relates to some of this, and hopefully we'll be in touch with many of you. But just to express somehow an apology around maybe some of the lack of clarity or some of the concerns that some people have, and to say that I think that we can address some of these through a valued and principled approach for this.
Thank you.
Thank you. The two last interventions here and there, please. John.
I believe that we've perhaps missed an opportunity when we meet in this space, civil society space, because at least we should talk about our own reality and our own strategies and our own coordination in order to be concrete in our actions and our vision. It's a pity that we've spent 3 days only focusing on the proposal that is not clear. Our definitions are often very risky, tricky. Compact, we don't know if it's mandatory, yes, no. It's a pity that us, civil society, coming from all over the place, we are full of experience, full of ideas, and we at least should leave with at least 1 or 2 action plans. What can we do, us, a civil society, to act against racism and discrimination, ? What can we do, us? What should be our message? Because there are people dying on a daily basis in the Mediterranean Sea. It's a pity that we're going to go home. We've discussed an abstract test. Nothing clear, it's totally unclear. But what are we going to do in practice? Us, civil society, nada, nothing. Secondly, I believe the consultation structures should be democratic, and also people organizing this forum, civil society. What I notice is that there are regions that are not represented in the vision. In order to make sure that the system is a democratic system, we need to make sure that we are all acting in a democratic way.
Thank you. The last interventions, John and his colleague.
The reports are, quite honestly, some of them are completely empty. Some are proposals. Some do not report what's been said in the panel discussions. Firstly, so next time we need a better methodology. We need reports reporting what's been said and not what the rapporteurs believe. In some cases, the reports were good. In other cases, they weren't good at all. Then secondly, it's important to be absolutely clear, not beat about the bush. And as said, we need to be able to act in a decisive way in the compact. As was said, we need to include a visible, clear space for civil society. It needs to be present civil society. And it's just like the gentleman said, democracy, that's what we need. We need full democracy, and moreover, we've had enough. It's a bit too English-speaking.
Merci pour les...
And thank you for the last interventions, John Bingham. So thank you for the two last comments. Quite clearly, we need democracy in all our systems, organizational systems, global forum, all the different processes. That's our commitment, democracy. It's been our commitment for a long time, by the way. We have 34 networks working in our steering committee for 3 years, and they represent more or less all the regions throughout the world, but not enough. You're absolutely right. We need to widen this committee. Regarding the proposal, that is to include French-speaking and not just English-speaking people. Yes, I understand it's not easy, but it needs to be discussed absolutely, especially when we bear in mind the Global Forum in Morocco. But I wanted to thank also the members of the panel.
The panel was focused on international strategies, but I loved the way that you immediately went into regional and national. This whole structure for the afternoon is strategies across the world, across the planet, and very much at the three levels, never just international. In fact, if anything, much more now at the national level, even more than regional. It's all at the national level. So just on all of this advocacy and all of this planning and all of these action plans, it's never to control it from the center, wherever that is, Geneva or New York or one organization or one steering committee or one process. It's to do it everywhere. It's to bloom where we're planted. It's to do surround sound. I'm not afraid of 10 or 20 or 50 statements from civil society. I'm afraid when we don't have 200 of them. Some of them in our own names, some of them in our broad networks, and maybe one or two that are joint and signed by hundreds. Let's put all our statements up as kites until the sky is full with what we say on this, at every level.
Muchas gracias. Voy a regresar con el...
Thank you very much. I'll go back to the panel. We are talking about international strategies and regional strategies. There's one last panel to talk about national issues, and bearing in mind that we must set priorities, I wonder if you could answer to these questions, going back to priorities in terms of something which is a structural agenda. How can we link ourselves among the different regions in the following months, looking towards the Global Pact? Who wants to start?
William.
Well, just to continue with what John said, and that's exactly, I think, the sense of many in the room, at least, that the focus has to be where we are. So from national, regional, and my sister, you said, from Switzerland, you said, can we not work with existing regional networks? Well, that's exactly what we are saying. Regional networks, national organizations, international organizations, we have to reach out to our constituencies, we have to reach out to the people we work with and formulate what we think are key priorities for us, not for somebody else, key priorities for us at the level that we work, so that we do have those kind of different papers, different kind of thing. And there is also a thrust, I think eventually it would happen, and it is beginning, the beginnings of it are already there. people are congealing around, organizations are congealing around certain thematic areas, and that is happening. And that we've got an experience of this coming into this space for some years now. We've done this before. We've had our 8.5-year agenda, which we did in preparation for the higher level dialogue. It was not a perfect process. It did not cover the whole world as it should have, but it was able to make a difference in a negotiation that was happening, or in a consultation discussions that were happening. We've had in the SDG process as well, we've had similar experience. We had less time there, but it was an urgency to get SDGs, a migration on the SDGs. The world recognized, the governments recognized that in the MDGs, migration was not an issue. In the SDGs, we managed to squeeze that in at the last minute. So, but and none of our processes were universal or complete or perfect, none of them. And that is what we will have to understand. The question is, how do we keep the foot on the pedal when governments, in a situation like this, when the compact is going to happen 5 months from now. Whatever we want to put in, whatever we want to gather, organizational-wise, regional-wise, international-wise, has to be delivered in the next 5 months. In November, at the stock taking, that's when we'll have the semblance of what might be the beginnings of a -0. Is there a -0? Yeah, -0 draft, right? And that will form the basis of the first draft. It is then that we go into a whole different phase of negotiating then what are our red lines with governments. But at this time, yeah, let's do the thinking of it at different levels and organize that. So I think it's important what you said, sister, and what you said. I think to give those contributions at this stage is so important.
Gracias. Sí, Monami, por supuesto.
Just one thing to add to that. As these regional consultations begin, with the first one with Migrant Forum in Asia and others in Bangkok, and then our colleagues from Cross-Regional Center for Migrants and Refugees, the one in Beirut, I would also stress that it's important that those of us not in that region or in New York or Geneva or doing work at the global level really follow what's being said. What are the nuances of the various different issues, the ways we talk about labor migration or returns or women in migration or xenophobia? These have really practical inputs that should feed into the various global documents that our different networks are presenting for this process.
Thank you. Thanks for the couple of questions that I had. When I cited the ILO example, it was very much an approach or a model that has been inclusive of different voices and different partners, a process that is binding as a formal mechanism. And I think that we need to aspire to something similar within the migration debate too. I support the idea that unions should amplify the demand for regularization of migrants. That happened certainly from my parents and myself. I would support that wholeheartedly. And when I was talking earlier about the need to be honest, that wasn't just directed at politicians and governments, that was also directed at ourselves as trade unionists and as civil society, to speak up about the positive virtues and values of the migrant community and what they contribute to our societies. I know in my home country, now in the UK, enormous economic advantage of having migration, as well as the cultural and social dimensions too. And there was another remark around unions need to speak up for different voices. Well, unions are democratic organizations. They are constituted by people, ordinary people like yourselves and I, becoming members and therefore having a voice. And I think it's really a responsibility upon all of us to, let me do a plug. Join a union, please. Join a union. They're good for you. What's good for unions is good for society, because unions are comprised of our members of society. And likewise, I'd also say this. I mentioned earlier that I'm not just a trade unionist. I'm also a civil society partner in a migrant organization. It is important for trade unions to be involved in those different constituencies too. And I think that collaboration between the union side and the civil society side is absolutely critical to make sure that this process works, that this process is inclusive, that we amplify the voices of the constituencies that we're trying to represent. And then there was another comment about, trying to be concrete about, what can we concretely do? And a number of the colleagues have touched upon this notion of national work, and I absolutely subscribe to that. I think, we can't just wait for the compact to arrive and then perhaps see what is in there and what comes out of it, and then we look at how we try and implement that at the later date. We'll do that when the time comes. But there's lots of stuff that we can be doing right now too. It's not just the focus cannot and should not, in my view, only be on the compact. It's right and proper that we do focus on it, of course, get a good policy in place. But there's lots of other good policies already in place too. I think of the ILO conventions on migrant rights, on workers' rights and so forth. So few governments have adopted and ratified those conventions. That's stuff that we can go back to our own home countries and work with civil society, trade unions, etc., to get our governments to commit to doing those, to signing up to those conventions, to ratify those conventions, and to apply those protections. Because the protections that we're talking about that are going to appear, hopefully, in the compact are not new. Migration has been with us since time began, from Moses through to the present day. This is, migration is not a new phenomena. It isn't a new phenomena. We've had lots of time to think about actions and consequences, and it took a lot of hard work to get those ILO conventions in place. So why have people not followed up? Why have governments not ratified them? Why have governments not instituted legal protections in their national legislation? And what have we as civil society or trade unions done to force our governments to implement those protections? I don't want that to happen with the compact too, particularly if it's non-binding. So we have, some very concrete things that we can be doing, that we ought to be doing. I will just take liberty just to mention a couple of other examples of things that we can do. ILO conventions on the right to organise in collective bargaining. I know from my own experience of working with migrant workers, when government, national policies are not equal, actively discourage or prevent migrant workers from being able to come together, to organise, to unionise, to whatever you want to call it, to build their collective power, that is a serious impediment to migrant people, migrant communities being able to exercise their rights. When we don't allow, or rather when the labour laws in countries actively discourage or marginalise the migrant voice, we find that there are poor labour inspections in workplaces. There isn't resources being provided to allow migrant workers who are being exploited to be able to speak up and alert authorities to the help that they might need or the exploitation that is taking place. And yes, we do also, I will say in terms of firewalls, the last thing I'll just comment on is that this notion of building firewalls between public services and immigration control, this is a complete disaster. The idea that you're worried that your immigration papers will be checked before you can speak out, or rather than being able to stop violations happening. And this possibility, for me personally, I do a lot of work on possibility of rights, on education qualifications, on pension rights, on regularization of pathways to legal status, and the elimination of recruitment fees. Those are mechanisms that, or provisions that are already in place that need to be enforced. That is stuff that we can be getting on with right now, in parallel to our engagement in the work on the compact. So we don't have to wait for the compact, whatever comes out of that. There's plenty to be done now. Legal mechanisms that exist that we need to get ratified and put into practice. And those are critical factors that I would strongly encourage you to go away. The unions, if I may make a last plug, have produced a guidance which I believe is on the table outside. I saw it outside yesterday. Which outlines a number of these mechanisms and provisions that we really should be pursuing. So let's continue working together. That's the really critical factor. We're not working in isolation. We ought not to be working in silos. We depend on each other to make things work. And I think that is what we need to do at the national level, certainly, to support, I come back to this notion that what is good for unions is good for society. Why? Because we're democratic organizations. We are made up of society. So let's keep on working on that and make this a success. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Pav.
Thank you very much, Pat. My apologies for sticking to the times, but we'd like to listen different voices. And I've just heard very good news. We have a little bit more time, so I would like to make a good use of it so that one person from each of the regions, from the Middle East, one person from Asia, one person from Africa, another one from Latin America, from North America, and another one from Australia, gives us some insight, briefly gives us some insight on what are the steps to follow. What do you envisage as steps to follow based on what we've spoken? So what region would like to start? One person to speak on behalf of each region?
This is Rula from the Cross Region Center for Refugees and Migrants. I just want to make a couple of points. Following up the consultations that have been happening in Geneva and New York, we keep on hearing the idea that the Global Compact needs to be driven by evidence, it needs to be driven by facts, it needs to be driven by things that are happening on the ground. And it's very important to have experts that talk and feed into the discussion, but also if we need to know what's happening on the ground, we need to go to the regions and ask the regions what they think. And so instead of just taking the approach of the experts, we need to really listen to the regions. And in doing so, we need to go to the regions and consult them as a whole, let them come up with their voice, let them come up with what are their particular issues, and feed into the Global Compact. Talking about the MENA regions, there are very many things that are particular to this region. And here we talk about issues that we need to stress, and we need to make sure that they go into the Global Compact. We need to stress that labor and human rights in the region are not divisible. They have to go hand in hand, and they have to be guaranteed together. There's also the issue of the refugee, which is a big issue, and I know we're not touching upon the refugee issue, but in our region in particular, there are the refugees who are forced to be categorized as workers because they work to make a living and to meet ends meet, and sometimes they are in a situation of destination, but sometimes they're also in transit. And so the classification of those refugees as workers is something that we want to see incorporated and reflected. We need to make sure that these people don't fall through the cracks, that the discussion about them is there. The second thing I want to talk about is also, we know that there are limitations, and there are things that limit our ability to influence the compact, limit our ability. And Monami talked about the pace already, which is too much for the organizations who are working on the ground, too much for the regions to catch up sometimes. And so this is one of the things we have to live with, but there are also things we need to do. The second thing that also came up during our group discussions today from many people is also that the way the regions are divided is sometimes not reflective of the migration corridor. So for instance, in our region, we have the Asia-Middle East corridor, which is a huge corridor, and it's being divided as regions. So we have the Asia region consultation, we have the Middle East consultation, there's the Middle East Europe corridor, there's the Africa-Europe corridor. So you cannot really simplify and facilitate and just classify migration into different regions as it is in the compact. And so we're talking about strategy, and we're talking about how to address these issues, and I think it's important that we are in constant dialogues as regions, and this is our responsibility. We're not putting this up to the responsibility of other people, because this falls on us to ensure that, as William said, maybe we don't take up all the issues, but the way the issues are taken up are complementary and to truly reflect the issues on the ground. So this is also our responsibility. The final idea that I want to make, is that we need to recognize that in the different regions, governments play different roles, and governments are different in the different regions. In some places, maybe governments facilitate discussion, they open doors. In other regions, it's very difficult to talk about issues, and governments play a negative role. We've heard in Vincent about the discussion in Hungary. There are limitations when it comes to civil society, the space that is available to civil society. And so that's why I need to stress that we need to work together, we need to keep the dialogue happening, and we need to work in solidarity. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Vamos por regiones y ahorita regresamos.
We'll go by regions, and then we'll get back. Another region, please? Another region? What region?
Sí, brevemente.
So briefly, please, briefly.
Thank you very much. My name is
Hani Hoshti. I am a member of the so-called Germano-Moroccan Competence Network. I live here in Berlin. I am a linguist. I am an interpreter by trade. I'll be very, very short. I totally support what Mr. William Gois was saying when he was talking about the dialogue at national level. My hope is that once the compact is in place, hopefully, it's a hope, but once the compact is in place, we can then start genuinely working at international level to develop mechanisms and instruments that will then, I would say, convince and incentivize other states to join in the compact. If we have a text that is not basically ratified, and if it is ratified, not respected or implemented, then there's no point. So really, I believe that we need to find a way to make sure that it really becomes something that is ratified by many countries. Otherwise, civil society organizations here would have, spent a lot of time for nothing.
Que quien hable refleje posiciones.
Please, I would ask you to reflect the positions of some regions. Someone from Africa, please.
I come from Africa, here. My name is Ousmane Diarra. I come from Mali, West Africa, ECOWAS. Someone earlier was talking about decentralization and democracy, particularly as far as labor is concerned. I want to say this. Africa, as you know, is a continent that is very much affected by migration. There are lots of issues with African migrants. This was, by the way, discussed at the Valletta summit not long ago. What we want is to support migrants. We want to fight against forced repatriation. We want to support Africans if they want to go back to their countries of origin. That's one thing. The compact is something that is absolutely key. We need to work to make sure that it's not an empty document, but something that is genuine substance and content. I am a member of two platforms, two African platforms. PADMI first, which is rather recent. We work with colleagues there on the issue of migration. But I also work with another platform called MedAfrique. MedAfrique, I think, has worked on many occasions with some of you here in various environments. But our continent speaks, a lot of people speak French in Africa, more maybe than German or English. And I think that I agree with those who earlier mentioned the fact that Africa in the future, and possibly French-speaking Africa, needs, more of a voice. I'm here today. I'll travel back to Mali soon. I'll report about the work that has been done here. I need to produce reports. I need to produce documents. I need to disseminate information. But unfortunately, it will be difficult for me to do that and to make sure that people read those documents if we're not represented or not represented enough. So I think we need more democracy, more taking into account of people like myself and French as well. And there's not been many Africans sitting in the panel or in the various panels. So it's not racism, of course, but there's not a lot of African people who have participated to panels, and I think that's a bit sad.
Thank you very much. Anyone from Asia, from North America, from Latin America that can speak about the next steps in terms of the Global Compact? Marco? Good afternoon. Latin America is considering the possibility of having one or two regional fora, consultation fora, before another meeting that is being organized in Santiago de Chile. In order to prepare the draft zero meeting for the Global Compact in December, which will take place in Latin America as well. This work will imply to take the resolutions of this global forum to the communities, to implement consultation mechanisms that allow to carry the voices of the people about what we report about, in order to strengthen ourselves during this process, so that when in December we can have a position which is much more representative and better articulated. Thank you. From the other regions?
From Bangladesh. While we're talking about regularizing migration, safe migration, I'm afraid that one of the negative impact of this Global Compact on migration could be it may further marginalize already marginalized irregular migrants or undocumented refugees. Therefore, I'd like to recommend, as on one hand, it is trying to promote safe migration, on the other hand, it must include some words for the irregular migrants or undocumented refugees, and it must contribute their social and economic contribution to the local economy. So it must acknowledge that. So, thank you.
Muchas gracias. Adelante.
Thank you very much.
My name is Linda Al-Kalash. I am from Jordan. I will talk about Jordan and Middle East and North Africa. I think our region that has many challenges regarding to refugees and migrants, or let's say about mixed migrants. I think also our region that suffer from many regarding to workers in irregular situation and also refugees in irregular situation. The next step for this, and it's very important to work with the governments to have commitment regarding to the international conventions and other. For this initiative, it's very important, but it's very important also to take it seriously, not like the other initiatives that happened before. And also we will try to collect effort regarding to this through the Arab Network for Migrants, right? That it has members from 7 countries in our region, and it will extend to North Africa.
Gracias.
Thank you. 2 last interventions by Joshua. There is another region and then another one from a region that hasn't spoken yet. From North America. Colleagues, dear colleagues, we are giving the floor to all regions. Is anyone from North America that wants to share their views? Kathy? This is a space for regions, so Kathy?
National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. I'm really not speaking on behalf of the region, but just to share that we do plan to have a North American migration corridor consultation, probably in September in Washington, D.C. And we think it's very important to kind of deepen what is taking place at the global level, certainly within our region. There's a lot of tremendous organizing that's being done at many levels, local, state, national, within the United States and other regions. These are concerns that we share with our neighboring regions, and we hope to bring the input of our colleagues from the Caribbean, from Central America, from Mexico, as part of our deliberation in North America. As you know, we've faced some fairly severe migration problems. So on the one hand, there's an inspiration with what's being done at the global level. There's a lot of rich organizing being done, especially in the United States and other countries. But I don't think we have any illusions that what we face is something that's very long-term. Even while we're having this deliberation today, in the US, there are 60 to 75 very bad immigration bills pending in our Congress that can have lasting damage beyond what we will be able to do in the coming years with the Compact. So I think we're very hopeful that we can build bridges between the region and the global work. The organizing, the very vibrant work that's being done among migrant and refugee communities can make a contribution and deepen our global commitment. And I think what we're all doing globally can be an inspiration to strengthening the resolve of our communities who really face some very serious and long-term problems.
Gracias.
Thank you. I would request you to be understanding. Is there any region that hasn't spoken yet? Which region is it? No, we are giving the floor to the different regions. There are other spaces for that. I would kindly ask Joshua and Colin to make the last comments about the consultations.
Terrorism and Destination Unknown campaign. I'd like to share one very specific regional strategy which has come out of the discussion, thematic session on children and migrants in vulnerable situations today. Number one, we have something on children which we don't have as much or as developed and elaborated on other fields, which is the working document. It's been waived many times during this conference. So now what we need to do with this is not keep it at the international level, not keep it in a room like this where we preach to the converted and talk amongst each other, but bring this to national governments and regional representations. So we need to adapt it to the regional contexts, bring examples from your work, from your regions. Point two, take this methodology which has been developed from the Initiative for Child Rights in the Global Compacts with targets, goals, indicators, with very clear common messages as civil society in common, and use this for other fields, for migrants in vulnerable situations, and for all the other themes which have been discussed here, xenophobia, migrant workers, and so on, climate change, to have only mentioned a few of them. Thanks.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. We are going to close with Colin. He's going to provide us with specific information that he wants to share with us.
Can we have the next slide, please? This might be a little bit redundant now because we've had some really good feedback from the different regions, but I thought one of the important things to also highlight is something that Kathy referred to, a series of regional consultations that will be kicking off in the next few months. As I think it was Jibril and Rex who mentioned earlier in the panel, we have really 5 months. And my takeaway point from today's discussion is we need more democracy. So how can we make this compact more democratic, at least among us, among the civil society? One of the ways we can do that is really starting at the regional level and looking at how we can really, first of all, brief ourselves on what this compact is, what the process is, but also then to engage as broadly as possible, as many of us as possible at that level, so that we can both take it down to the country level and make sure that we're impacted at our capitals, but also emerge out some of this key recommendation and key points and inputs that we can take back to the global level and be present there as well with some strong advocacy. So just to highlight where we are in terms of these regional consultations, and I want to underline 2 important points here. One is if you're taking notes, don't write down the dates and the cities. Some of these are almost certain, some of these are still very fluid, and you see some have a lot of question marks to it. We're still building on these, so many of these can still change. The second point I also want to underline, you see some names, some networks listed up there. These are focal points, organizing groups, key people that are in discussions or pulling together discussions in the region to help make this happen. This does not by any means mean that this is exclusive to that particular network only or that particular person and their closest friends or anything like that at all. This is a very, very wide open process as much as we want to and we can hope to have. So just to run down really quickly and already, otherwise this might be redundant. Some of us have already talked about this in this discussion here. Alphabetically, the Africa consultation being led and focal pointed by the Pan-African Network on Migration, hoping to take place in Bamako, in Mali, on the 28th and 29th of August. I think Milka's here, Mamadou's here, and then many others who are involved in that. You can always talk to them more about that for more information and more engagement about that. The Asia consultation being led by Migrant Forum Asia, William, Tatsi, and everybody else from the MFA network, and as well as many others from the Asia region. That will take place in Bangkok, possibly on the 3rd and 4th of August. That's actually the first one. And then the one for Europe will be co-led by PICUM. Michelle was just here a second ago, and then Made Europe jointly. And that will most probably take place in Brussels, somewhere around September, October. I'm told in Europe nothing happens in August, so I guess it has to happen after that. And then for Latin America, we're still kind of pulling that together, some key points that we still need to get through, but some key people to talk to around here, Berenice, Oscar, and many others are involved in this discussion, many of you from the Latin America region. That will possibly take place in September in a place to be decided. For the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, being led by the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, Rula just spoke earlier. And that will take place in Beirut on the 24th and 25th of August. For North America, Kathy already talked about this. I don't want to repeat too much. Washington, D.C. in September. And then finally, we might have a Pacific sub-regional consultation being led by MFA. I think Nicola also is involved in helping pull that together to be decided west, somewhere in the Pacific, and possibly in October. So we just want to list this out as, again, points for us to take out of here where we can continue this engagement and really build, I think, some of what we talked about in terms of building some constructive regional points and that reflect what's happening at the country level to take to the Global Compact. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Colin.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, everyone, for your understanding. The most difficult role that I have had is to be the facilitator, and I regret not being able to give the floor to everyone, but we need to move on and listen to all voices. There's not going to be a coffee break, so if you want to grab a coffee, you can take it. We can have coffee here, and we are going to move on to the next and last panel, to close this forum. I would request the following panelists to come on stage. A round of applause for William, Benami, and Pav.